If you are watching us from the last home you'll ever own tonight, consider yourself lucky.
Between 2006 and 2012, American households lost approximately $13 trillion in net worth. Home equity, retirement savings, employment income, gone. Not transferred to another country, not destroyed by a foreign power, moved. Quietly, legally, and in many cases with full documentation filed with federal regulators. Some people had a very different experience of those years. This video documents 10 of them, their names, their numbers, and where the paper trail goes, exactly how the math worked. Not one of them broke a law, not one of them went to prison. All of it is in the record. Most of it has always been in the record. That is where we are going.
So you made a ton of money?
Made a ton of money. Much more than I ever imagined, I'd ever have.
Before you can understand how anyone made money from the 2008 collapse, you need to understand the instrument that made it possible. A credit default swap is, at its simplest, an insurance policy on a debt. You pay a premium. If the debt defaults, you collect. The difference between a credit default swap and ordinary insurance is that you do not have to own the thing you are insuring. You can take out a policy on your neighbor's house. If it burns down, you get paid. Your neighbor does not need to know you bought the policy. The seller of the policy does not need to verify that you have any connection to the house at all. Michael Burry understood this in 2005. Burry was a one-eyed former medical student with an Asperger's diagnosis running a small hedge fund called Scion Capital out of a converted office in San Jose. He was not a mortgage specialist. He was not a fixed-income trader. He sat down and read the actual loan documents underlying mortgage-backed securities, thousands of pages that almost no one on Wall Street had bothered to read, and concluded that the bonds rated AAA by the major agencies were built on loans that would default at rates the ratings did not remotely account for. He began purchasing credit default swaps on those bonds in 2005, 3 years before the collapse. His investors were not pleased. They threatened legal action. They demanded their money back. The thesis wasn't working yet. He was paying premiums on policies that hadn't paid out, and they wanted out. Burry locked the fund. He held the positions. When the bonds collapsed, Scion Capital returned approximately $700 million in gains to its investors. Burry made roughly $100 million personally. The investors collected. Most of them did not publicly acknowledge what had happened or why. Burry closed the fund afterward. He returned the capital and went quiet. The system that rewarded him $100 million for correctly identifying its own fragility had no further use for him once the trade was done. He had not invented the trade. He had only been the first to place it at scale. Someone else read what Burry was doing and decided he wanted in. Andrew Lade ran a small hedge fund in Santa Monica. In 2007, his fund returned 870%. Not 87, not 8.7, 870% on short positions in subprime mortgage securities placed against the same bonds Burry had identified using the same instruments. In October 2008, Lade dissolved the fund, returned all investor capital, and sent a farewell letter. It was published in full by The Guardian and reprinted across the financial press. It is a primary source document. It exists. You can read it today. In it, Lade thanked his counterparties, the institutions on the other side of his trades, for making his success possible. He described them as low-hanging fruit. He attributed his 870% return not to his own genius, but to their incompetence. He noted that he had been dealing with people who were, in his characterization, the products of inherited privilege and expensive educations, who had been handed positions of financial authority they did not understand and could not justify. Then he retired. He has rarely spoken publicly since. The people he described in that letter, the counterparties, the institutions, the beneficiaries of the system he had just beaten, went on to receive hundreds of billions of dollars in federal assistance. Several of them are later in this video. Lade had learned the trade from someone. That someone turned the same knowledge and into $800 million. Jeffrey Green made his money in real estate. California properties, development projects. He was, by any reasonable description, a creature of the same housing market that was quietly building toward collapse. He and Lade knew each other. Green learned about credit default swaps through that connection, not through a trading desk, not through a structured finance department, but through a conversation. He understood what Lade was doing. He decided to do the same thing with his own money. Green purchased approximately $750 million in credit default swaps on mortgage bonds through Bear Stearns and other dealers, betting that the bonds underlying the American real estate market would collapse. They did. His reported gain was approximately $800 million. A real estate developer made $800 million betting that real estate would fail. The mortgages backing the bonds he shorted belonged to American families who were about to lose their homes. The transaction required no disclosure to those families. No law required one. The instrument was designed to work exactly this way. Green placed many of his trades through Bear Stearns. Bear Stearns collapsed in March 2008. It no longer exists. Greg Lippmann was a trader at Deutsche Bank. He identified the same trade as Burry, assembled short positions against mortgage CDOs, and, in a detail that is either admirably honest or spectacularly brazen, depending on your perspective, began pitching the trade to outside investors. He handed out buttons at industry conferences. The buttons read, "I'm short, you're subprime." Several of the people he handed those buttons to were long the same securities. They took the buttons, they bought more bonds. Lippmann received approximately $47 million in bonus compensation in 2007. That figure appears in multiple sourced accounts from the period. The detail that makes it complicated is this. While Lippmann was selling the short thesis to outside investors, Deutsche Bank itself held long positions in mortgage securities. He was arguing to people outside his firm that the market would collapse, while his own firm remained on the other side of that argument. He did not hide this. He wore it on a button. The market did not correct for it. The bonds were sold, the ratings held, the collapse came anyway. Lippmann was selling the short, someone else was selling the long, and also selling it to his own clients while quietly going short himself. Steve Eisman ran a small team within Morgan Stanley's Front Point hedge fund. He came from equity research, not fixed income, not structured credit, which meant he came to the mortgage market without the assumptions that insiders had spent careers building. Before placing his short positions, Eisman did something unusual. He took meetings. He sat down with senior executives at mortgage originators, bond rating agencies, and CDO issuers. He asked them to explain their products. He listened. He later said that he came away from those meetings believing that almost none of them understood what they were selling, not as a moral failing, as a technical one. The instruments had become so layered, so abstracted from the underlying loans that the people packaging and rating and selling them had lost the thread back to the actual mortgages, the actual borrowers, the actual houses. He shorted them. They gave the bonds AAA ratings. His fund generated gains in the hundreds of millions. The precise figure is not in the public record, and this video won't invent one. What is in the record is the structure. He met the people building the machine, concluded the machine was broken, and placed his bet accordingly. The machine ran for another 2 years before it stopped. The rating agencies that gave AAA ratings to the bonds Eisman was shorting faced civil suits. None of the individuals who assigned those ratings were criminally prosecuted. John Paulson, the largest trade in Wall Street history. Everything before this has been large. John Paulson reframes the scale. Paulson and Company made approximately $15 billion in short positions in mortgage-backed securities. John Paulson personally made approximately $4 billion in 2007, the largest single-year personal trading gain in Wall Street history at the time. His analyst, Paolo Pellegrini, built the underlying thesis. Pellegrini made $175 million. Pellegrini left the firm shortly after. But the number is not the most significant documented fact about John Paulson's trade. This is, in 2006 and 2007, Paulson worked with Goldman Sachs to help construct a collateralized debt obligation, Abacus 2007 AC1. The CDO was built partly to Paulson's specifications. He wanted specific mortgage bonds included, bonds he believed would fail. Goldman assembled the instrument. Goldman sold it to clients. Goldman did not disclose to those clients that the entity helping select the underlying assets had taken a short position against it. Think of it this way. Imagine a car dealer asks a mechanic to help him build a vehicle. The mechanic selects the parts, specifically parts he knows will fail. The dealer sells the car. The dealer does not tell the buyer that the mechanic who chose the parts is betting the car won't make it to the end of the block. The car breaks down. The mechanic collects. The SEC investigated. In April 2010, Goldman Sachs settled for $550 million, at the time, the largest penalty ever levied against a Wall Street firm by the SEC. Goldman neither admitted nor denied wrongdoing. John Paulson was not charged. The SEC determined he had no duty to disclose his role to the buyers on the other side. No law required him to. Goldman paid $550 million. Paulson kept $4 billion. The settlement was announced, documented, and filed. Then, Goldman collected something else. Kyle Bass ran Heyman Capital in Dallas. His fund reportedly returned over 200% in 2007 on short positions in mortgage securities. Figures from reported sources, not SEC disclosures, and written here with that caveat. Bass is on this list for his documented return. He is also on it for the nickels. In 2011, Bass purchased $4 million worth of nickels, not as a novelty, as a documented financial position. His argument was that the metal content of a nickel, the actual copper and nickel, was worth more than 5 cents, and that currency debasement would eventually make that gap meaningful. He discussed this publicly. It was reported at the time. The nickels exist somewhere in a Texas warehouse. A Dallas hedge fund manager made hundreds of millions of dollars shorting the American mortgage market, then spent $4 million on nickels as a hedge against the collapse of the American dollar. The nickels remain legal tender. The mortgage bonds they were hedging against are not. In November 2009, Lloyd Blankfen told a reporter that Goldman Sachs was doing God's work. He may have been joking. The Senate did not find it funny. In April 2011, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations released its report on the financial crisis. It ran to 650 pages. It was built, in significant part, on Goldman Sachs's own internal emails. Those emails documented that Goldman held a net short position in mortgage securities through much of 2007, while simultaneously continuing to sell mortgage-backed products to its clients. The report found that Goldman's executives described the products they were selling in internal communications in terms that differed substantially from how those products were described to buyers. In April 2010, Lloyd Blankfen testified before Congress that Goldman's short positions were hedges, not directional bets on the collapse of the market. The Levin-Coburn report, released a year after that testimony, directly disputed that characterization, using Goldman's own words. Goldman received $10 billion in TARP funds in October 2008. It received $12.9 billion through the federal bailout of AIG, paid at 100 cents on the dollar. Lloyd Blankfein received $9 million in total compensation in 2008. The math: Goldman shorted the market, sold the long to clients, received $22.9 billion in federal assistance. Its CEO was paid $9 million in the year the system nearly failed. A Senate report built on Goldman's own internal communications concluded the firm's congressional testimony was misleading. No Goldman executive was criminally prosecuted. The Department of Justice closed its investigation in 2012 without charges. The money that flowed to Goldman through the AIG bailout had to be decided by someone. That someone used to run Goldman. Jamie Dimon is the most defensible figure on this list. That is worth saying plainly, because this video does not work if it pretends the frame applies equally to everyone in it. JP Morgan Chase reduced its subprime exposure earlier than its major peers. That decision is attributed to Dimon and his risk team. The bank received $25 billion in TARP funds in October 2008 and repaid the full amount with interest in June 2009. By the standards of the crisis, JP Morgan was managed responsibly. Jamie Dimon received $19.7 billion in total compensation in 2008. That is what responsible looks like in this system. The most carefully managed major bank in America still required $25 billion in federal assistance to remain stable during a crisis its industry created. Its CEO still received nearly $20 million in the year that crisis nearly took the global economy with it. The irresponsible ones did considerably better. There are two Paulsons in this story. John Paulson ran a hedge fund. Hank Paulson ran the United States Treasury. Both made extraordinary sums connected to the same collapse. The shared name is not a metaphor. It is just what happened. Here is what the documents show about Hank Paulson. In 2006, Paulson left Goldman Sachs to become Treasury Secretary. Under an SEC rule designed to encourage executives to enter public service, he was permitted to sell his Goldman stake upon appointment without paying capital gains tax. His Goldman stake was valued at approximately $485 billion. The tax benefit on a gain that size is not a rounding error. As Treasury Secretary, Paulson became the principal architect of the federal government's response to the 2008 collapse. In September and October of that year, he designed and executed the bailout of AIG, the insurance company whose credit default swap exposure had made it a systemic risk to the entire financial system. The Special Inspector General for TARP, a government watchdog created specifically to oversee bailout spending, released a report in November 2009. It documented that Goldman Sachs received $12.9 billion through the AIG bailout. It documented that Goldman was paid at 100 cents on the dollar, the full face value of its claims, while other AIG counterparties accepted negotiated reductions. The decision to pay Goldman in full was made by officials at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the Treasury Department. The Treasury Secretary was Hank Paulson. His former employer, Goldman Sachs, he had sold his stake in the firm for approximately $485 billion, tax-free as a condition of taking the job that put him in the room where that decision was made. The SIG TARP report raised questions about the decision. A congressional hearing raised questions about the decision. No criminal investigation followed. No law was found to have been broken. The payment stood. The paper trail exists. It was produced by the government. It has always been available. The documents in this video, the SEC settlement, the Senate report, the SIG TARP findings, the congressional testimony, the proxy filings, the investor letters were not leaked. They were not obtained through years of investigative litigation. They were filed, published, and released through ordinary institutional channels. The Senate produced a 650-page report using a bank's own emails and placed it in the public record. The Treasury's own watchdog documented a payment of $12.9 billion to the former employer of the man who authorized it. None of it was hidden. All of it was legal. Between 2006 and 2012, $13 trillion in American household net worth disappeared. The 10 people in this video, traders, executives, a developer, a Treasury Secretary, collectively made somewhere north of $6 billion in documented or credibly reported gains during the same period. Some of that money came from correctly anticipating the collapse. Some of it came from helping construct the instruments that accelerated it. Some of it came from the federal response to it. The system that produced all of this, the financial architecture, the regulatory framework, the revolving door between government and the institutions government oversees, was not dismantled after 2008. It was stabilized, refinanced, and returned to operation. The paper trail is still there. It always was.